Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. It's my pleasure to introduce this different kind of episode. We normally focus on biblical studies and theology, and sometimes we'll do a more tangentially related subject like the episode we're bringing to you today. So this is a book I read recently and was so compelled and interested in the subject that I wanted to interview the author, Wolf Gruner, about a subject that I read around in, namely Holocaust studies. And I think you'll find it really interesting. He has an interesting life story, and his research is fascinating in the subject of Jewish resistance in the lead up to and during the Holocaust. So I hope you find this fascinating and check out his book. Thanks to Taylor Terzek for producing this episode, and to all of you who support the podcast. You can do so by giving us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or some other platform. If you haven't done that yet, why not make today the day when you do that? All right, thanks everybody. Enjoy. Welcome back, everyone. Our guest today is Dr. Wolf Gruner, who holds the Chappell-Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and is professor of history at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles since 2008. He's also the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research since 2014. He's the author of 10 books and many other publications, among them his book, Jewish Forced Labor Under the Nazis, published by Cambridge University Press. And in 2016, he published a prize-winning book, it was republished in English in 2019, called The Holocaust in Bohemia and Moravia. And it's also going to be published in Hebrew, I understand, as well. He's co-edited 4 books. He's an appointed member of the academic committee of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, is on an advisory board for the Center for Research on the Holocaust in Germany at Yad Vashem's Research Institute, and much more. And the book for discussion today is Resistors: How Ordinary Jews Fought Persecution in Hitler's Germany. Dr. Gruner, welcome to OnScript.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, this episode is a bit outside the normal scope of what we cover in this podcast, but the topic interests me greatly. So, I got this email from Yale indicating, letting me know what new books were out, and they mentioned yours and said, do you want a review copy for consideration for the podcast? And I thought, we don't normally do books just on history or on the Holocaust more broadly, but this one caught my attention in part just out of personal interest. I've read around in this subject, and feel like I have a lot of questions. I also spent a couple years in Göttingen. In your book, you mentioned Göttingen, and we had for listeners, we had Susanna Heschel on the podcast several years ago, talked about her book on the Aryan Jesus in the Institute for the Study of and Eradication of Jewish Influence in German Religious Life. But this book's new territory. So, this fits within more broadly the Holocaust studies, study of anti-Jewish policies and responses among Jews in Germany and beyond. So perhaps you could help our listeners by orienting them to the field of Holocaust studies more broadly. What are the big questions at play in research that scholars are pursuing?
So that's a large question and could fill kind of another podcast. But just to keep it brief, I would say main concern for a long time was the study of the perpetrators, to find out why are people committing these crimes, what are their motives, their incentives, and so on. More recently, there's a lot of study on the impact of the persecution onto the Jewish population. I think also more evolving is now kind of how the Jewish population responded. And I think that's where my book fits in very well, is to really thinking about Jews not as just as victims of an oppression and kind of an extermination policy, but really as historical actors.
Yeah, as agents with, you talk about in the book. So we'll get to that. I'd like to hear maybe a bit more from you personally. What prompted your interest in this subject? You've written, this isn't your first book dealing with Nazism and the Holocaust. So what is it that drew you into this field initially?
You mean in general Holocaust studies, or you mean how I came to the subject of resistance?
So more broadly, and then maybe you could then talk about the particulars of this book.
Yeah. So it's kind of a very kind of twisted story, because I grew up in East Germany under the communist regime, and at the time, after finishing high school with some problems because of I was a little bit starting to be distant to the regime. I was actually a poet and wrote short stories, worked in the printing office, and I didn't actually think about studying or going to college. And so, but I had in my daily life experiences of racism among the East German population, and especially in my personal life with one of my first love. She was half Vietnamese and half German, and so I experienced a lot of kind of slurs against her, kind of insults and so on. And this, as you can imagine, when you are young and you are in love, this is really impacting you emotionally very deeply. And so I started reading about where is racism coming from? What are the kind of the reasons for racism? And at the time we are talking at the beginning of the 80s, most of the books talking about the subjects were on the one hand on the Holocaust, and the second one, they would say it always kind of requests a state-sponsored ideology. However, this kind of collided with my personal experience in East Germany, because in East Germany, the state was actually the opposite. It was kind of promoting workers in the whole world are equal, right? Solidarity with kind of developing countries in Asia and Latin America. So the state never promoted racism. However, on the ground, within the East German population, there was fierce racism and fierce racist attitude. So to understand this kind of contradiction, I decided to study history. So this is actually why I really got into undergraduate studies in history, with the aim to investigate the Holocaust as a prime German example, and to kind of somehow to understand this phenomenon.
And so you studied. Now, did you study that in East Germany, or was that elsewhere?
No, so I kind of applied to study history at one of the East German universities in Berlin, and was first rejected because I had not a kind of a clean political record.
Okay.
Because I was part of this kind
your
of...
poetry was not up to snuff, huh?
No, it was, they didn't want to publish it. I was part of this cultural underground where a lot of the political dissidents, but also artists met in East Berlin. And which also kind of, we can talk about this later, I think primed me a little bit for this topic. So when I was rejected, then I approached the only kind of academic in East Germany who worked on the Holocaust, and asked him and said point blank, I want to study the Holocaust. Can you help me to get into the university? And he did. So he kind of managed to get me an interview. I passed, and then I was in. It was not easy because in East Germany it was very kind of dogmatic studies, and so I had also was almost expelled from the university again. But I studied this already then. My whole studies were kind of focusing on this topic. I wrote my senior thesis on the later topic of my dissertation, which was Jewish forced labor outside of concentration camps.
Right.
And then I finished my undergraduates when the wall came down. And this was a very kind of lucky coincidence, because I could not have done my PhD in East Germany because, as I said, I was a little bit distant to the regime. I was not a member of the Communist Party. And so I could have not have had an academic career in East Germany.
Yes, that's good timing. So I'm curious about your experience as a poet in East Germany. It kind of reminds me of like the person that comes to mind for me is Václav Havel in what's became the Czech Republic. So what kinds of things were you doing as a poet? And in what ways did your kind of experiences as in that form of resistance shape your thinking then for this book?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, I wrote poems and short stories, and they were, in a way, I didn't find them really extremely critical, but they used time, for example, forms which were not kind of mainstream kind of socialist poetry, so kind of more expressionist forms, kind of playing with words, and somehow even this kind of diverging from mainstream was perceived as kind of not kind of appropriate in kind of socialist culture. And then I had a lot of kind of connections with more prominent kind of cultural dissidents who kind of also published their poetry in the West, which I never did. And so, and there was kind of surveillance of these circles, everything we kind of organized, for example, readings, which were kind of done in private kind of environments like apartments or patios. We went to music acts, which were also kind of not officially kind of listed. And so there was a lot of this kind of stuff all going on. And we were always had to be aware where kind of the police, the security service, and some of my friends kind of were also kind of in a way persecuted. And so this is, which I think created an understanding how little things can be perceived by a state as dangerous and are persecuted. Even things you normally in an open society would never kind of perceived as dangerous for a state, right? State has all kind of the whole power, so it would not kind of make any dent. But in a kind of a closed society, in an authoritarian regime, that's very different. And I think this provided me a very different sensibility for what I later discovered in the files. But it was, coming back to your original question, a long way from kind of throughout my books from where I started, because I was trained as a German historian. German historians at the time were trained more to look into institutions than into people. So I started out with kind of looking into like civil kind of authorities, how they kind of participated, initiated anti-Jewish persecution, first labor offices, regarding Jewish forced labor, but then also municipalities, because they were often kind of employing Jewish forced laborers, and I started to get more into them. What did municipalities do? And there I found the question very intriguing, that a lot of the initiatives were very diverse. So every municipality acted differently. So there was not kind of this old kind of understanding at play that everything is directed from the center, from Berlin, from Hitler, and so on.
Right.
There was a lot of initiative on the bottom, and very much showed me how dependent these policies are on individual people and their responsibilities. So individual mayors, kind of heads of departments. And interestingly, it also opened my eyes that, for example, some of the most fierce anti-Jewish policies on the local level were not introduced by Nazis, but sometimes from non-Nazi party members. So when I saw these diverse polities, how they evolved, and then I started to think about how did they actually impact the Jewish population, right? How did the Jews kind of understood these policies? And I think this also explains a little bit why so many Jews did not leave the country, because in the beginning it was really what happened in Hamburg was very different what happened in Leipzig or in Frankfurt or Berlin. And then if you were a businessman, you were treated differently in Hamburg than, for example, in Göttingen or in Dresden. And the same is true if you lived in Hamburg. If you were poor, you were really exposed to harsh anti-Jewish measures. But as a businessman, you could relatively kind of get along for quite a while. So this showed me how diverse these policies were and how they were also received on the Jewish population. But when I looked into this, then I realized the Jews also responded to this. For example, the Jewish communities, Jewish organizations. So they kind of responded to these policies. And this kind of provided, it's a long trajectory of 2 decades of research. Then it provided the ground then for the moment when I found this first document, which led me to the book, which was in 2008 when I was sitting in an archive in Berlin. And I looked at a source nobody had looked at ever for the persecution of the Jews. These were police diaries of local Berlin police precincts. And I had looked at them earlier for another work, and I decided that at some point I wanted to go through them systematically. So there are 30 kind of diaries that has survived in the Berlin archive of different police precincts, and they range from 33 till 45. So when I was hired at USC, I took 3 months off and said I go through them before I go to the US, because I will probably never have the chance to have so much time anymore. And that's when I found the first trace of this Jewish man who was arrested for protesting the persecution of the Jews, and which hit me kind of in various ways, because I never found something similar. That just the idea that Jews protested in public against Hitler or against the Nazis or against the persecution was so foreign for our understanding, right?
Yeah, that kind of brings me to the question, like in popular accounts of the Holocaust, people are often familiar with the Jewish uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto or the revolt at Treblinka and other places as well. But as you mentioned in the book, there's this trope that Jews were led like sheep to the slaughter, and a kind of general willingness of victims to follow orders. So where does that view come from, and how does that need correcting in light of your research?
Yeah. So that's a very complex question, because on the one hand, this kind of perspective to focus on Jewish resistance, mainly looking at Poland, Eastern Europe, uprisings in ghettos, and, for example, partisans activities in the woods, comes actually, or kind of evolves already during the war. So the first publications, for example, in English, like from 1942, talking kind of extensively or analyzing extensively the persecution of the Jews and the first kind of glimpses of the extermination policy, they have chapters on resistance in them. And this one book from 1942, but this exclusively focuses on these uprisings and partisans. So there is this idea resistance is always organized and needs to be armed to be perceived as resistance.
Right.
This kind of never was let go. And I think focusing on the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and partisan activity, for a long time, we didn't have a lot of evidence of kind of the scope of these activities. So they seem to be isolated incidents, right? And this kind of, in a way, confirms the idea that Jews didn't really resist, because these were the exceptions of the rule. Today we know better that even in Eastern Europe, first of all, there was tons of partisan activities which we never were aware of, which we know now know. We know a great more deal about the ghettos, what was going on. There's also a broader understanding more recently that it's not just about, let's say, armed resistance. There's what Israeli scholars already after the war kind of tried to emphasize, that there was cultural activity as resistance. There was religious kind of, the preservance of religion as an act of resistance. However, all of these kind of approaches, the old ones and also the more recent ones, they never really look at Germany. They always look at Poland and Eastern Europe. And so it was, in a way, there was the sense that in Germany, never really something happened, resistance-wise, because there were not kind of spectacular acts of resistance like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising or the partisans.
Yeah.
And even if there were, like there was, for example, an attack on a Nazi propaganda exhibit in 1942 in May by a kind of a leftist Jewish forced labor underground group, it's not widely known. So it was kind of some people know, but it's not really a public kind of knowledge. And so to look into Germany, what happened, and so it kind of evolved this idea. The Jews in Germany adapted to the anti-Jewish policies because they were gradually, this was different from Poland, where it was kind of very harsh and very immediate and very quick. They had time to adapt, and I think this created this wrong picture that people kind of just subsumed to what the Nazis did and then either to trying to get out or kind of followed what happened. And I think my book kind of revises this entirely.
Yeah, kind of like being slowly boiled in water and just eventually it's too late, right? And so what kind of resistance are you exploring then in this book? We have the model of the French resistance, this kind of integrated, organized network. Is it that sort of thing that you're interested in, or how would you characterize the types and nature of this resistance in Germany?
Yeah, so I focus in the book on exclusively on individual acts of resistance. That means by individual persons, single persons, and this gives me the opportunity to kind of rebrand what we understand of individual of Jewish resistance by including individual acts. This enables me to see a wide range of acts, and as I alluded to earlier, it is in a way what the regime perceives as a threat. So what we sometimes don't really see, that very small acts can be perceived as a threat. And just to give the kind of your listener one kind of example from today, think about the Russia right now. Yeah. There was this one example where a woman sat on a square with a blank paper.
Right.
This is nothing, actually, if you think about it, right? To sit with a blank paper, but it was perceived...
The very definition of nothing.
Yeah, but it was perceived by the Russians as a threat. And she was immediately arrested because they assumed this is a protest against the war.
Yeah.
So this is kind of what I see, that the circumstances, the conditions actually create kind of these acts of resistance. And people are aware what they are doing. This woman was not sitting kind of by coincidence there with this blank piece of paper. Similar is true for what I investigate with the Jews, which ranges from, their acts range, so to speak, from, for example, contestation of anti-Jewish propaganda and Nazi propaganda, from destroying Nazi symbols, ripping down Nazi flags. That's one part. Then I talk in the book about public protest, so verbal protest of Jews, which is either against kind of certain anti-Jewish legislation, or it can be also scolding Hitler in public and the whole kind of Nazi entourage. Similarly, another area is kind of written protest, which ranges from petitions to all kinds of Nazi institutions, which often are kind of seen as written in vain, but they included a lot of kind of self-determination, because Jews defined themselves as Germans, as kind of participating in German culture, contributing to their home country, and so on. But then it goes till, for example, anonymous leaflets, scolding Hitler. One of my stories in the book is of a 63-year-old real estate broker from Munich, who very late during the war is so fed up after the Yellow Star is introduced, that he writes anonymous postcards.
Right.
And he calls Hitler a mass murderer. This was in 1941, beginning of 1942, where barely kind of information about what happened in the East trickled into Germany. So he was kind of, in a way, very prophetic in what he did.
Yeah.
And this was not a small feat, because these anonymous postcards led to a trial at the German People's Court, where he still defended his actions, as that he scolded Hitler for kind of promoting the extermination of the Jews, and he kind of suffered the consequences by being executed after receiving the death penalty. And the last kind of areas are disobedience to anti-Jewish legislation and local restrictions, and then physical self-defense against verbal insults or physical attacks.
Yeah, just to go back to the story of the man who sent the postcards, I found that to be a really moving and powerful story. One of the surprises of this book is that it is a work of history, but in many ways it's 5 mini biographies with then kind of reflections beyond those individuals, and I think that's what makes the book very engaging. Is you have these stories. So this guy sends postcards. His wife doesn't even know that he's doing this, because he probably doesn't want her to maybe stop him or get her in trouble. Maybe he just figures, hey, if she doesn't know, she can deny knowledge of it. But he sent, I wrote down one poem he wrote. Since you're a poet, I figured this was a point of connection. So he would send these anonymous postcards with a stamp on it that say, Heil Murderer. And then his poem is, the Almighty is in heaven. The Führer, so it's Führer, play on the German word Führer, is an atrocity person. God decides for all people everything and doesn't tolerate other gods. Hail, he is himself a god indeed. Speaking about Hitler. He even had a prophetic statement on one of his postcards that says murderer of 5 million, which is pretty astounding. I forget what year that was, 42 maybe.
Yeah.
He's not far from the final tally on that. So, just remarkable stories. And when you dig into any individual story, you point out that these are not we can't just think of them as purely individual acts. Do you want to just comment on that sort of between category? It's not a sort of organized mass network, but it's also not isolated.
Yeah, so, while I focused on these individual stories and the individual acts, to just make a really kind of clear point in juxtaposition to what previously was done research-wise, and kind of also to challenge our public understanding of what Jewish resistance was during the Holocaust. So I focus very much on the individual. I say at the end of the book that no individual exists alone. Yeah. So there is always a network. And while I didn't go myself into it, I think that's up to further research to really tease out the importance of these private networks, which consists of family, right? Yeah. First and foremost, friends, but can also include neighbors, workmates, people you meet like by coincidence, but also your kind of religious and communal institutions. So I think there is this kind of context for your actions, because I think what I learned is it is really important how the people you are close with, how they respond if you talk to them. So while he was not, the real estate broker from Munich was not talking to his wife, still he kind of experienced with her all the persecution. And they, what I try to do in the book is not just to tell their individual stories, but also to give the reader a sense how this local persecution environment was also different in each city. So they experienced, for example, that they had to move into a kind of a camp, right, the outskirts of the city. So these shared experiences also are which kind of influencing individual decisions, I think. And people can sometimes consciously or unconsciously confirm your decision-making, or they can also challenge your decision-making because it's too risky or whatever.
Yeah, so I've talked about this man, Benno Neuberger, who sent these postcards. Did you have another sort of favorite story as you were researching that really stood out to you?
Yeah, I mean, there are what is striking is, I mean, there are so many stories. The problem is often the evidence, sometimes the kind of sources are scarce. They are
Right.
often very kind of brief. So it was really hard to do, and that's why it took me 12 years to research this book, is to find really enough material to write a full-fledged kind of story.
Yeah.
But one of these stories, it's really also another heartbreaking one, is the one of Hans Oppenheimer from Frankfurt, who is kind of a 17-year-old boy who also during the war, which, by the way, also speaks to the situation that the resistance doesn't kind of reduces itself the more persecution is there. Right. It's kind of in waves. And so in 1940, he breaks every night the curfew because he goes out and waits for the Allied bombing campaigns. And when the sirens start to kind of howl, then and the bombs are starting to fall, then he sets off wrong fire alarms to divert the fire trucks, the firefighters, from the actual bombing sites. Yeah. And he does this kind of for weeks in Frankfurt in the fall and winter of 1940, until the Gestapo sets a trap and they finally get him, because he fears to get caught, he moves only kind of very close to his home. He's then put on trial, and he's supposed to be tried as an 18-year-old, as an adult, but fortunately he's not. He ends up getting 3 years in prison for these fire alarms. He never admits how many actually he set off. So my assumption is he set off around 40. They only can prove him, I think, 9 in the trial. And it is really remarkable. Then he goes into he's in jail, and he's only 18. He never had a life actually in Germany, because even as a 16-year-old, when he finished school, he had to be he was recruited as a forced laborer. So he, with 16 and 17 years old, he had to perform heavy forced labor. So he was already exhausted, and physically and also emotionally, when he went to jail. And he tries to commit suicide twice in jail. Yeah. And then in the end, he's not successful. He gets very sick, but still in jail. He is kind of, in a way, he is rebellious. So he complains all the time about the conditions he's set in, that he can't get doctor's visits. So even in jail, under these circumstances, he is still kind of not submitting to the pressure and the oppression. And in the end, unfortunately, he then was deported to Auschwitz, where he immediately perishes. And so he was not even 20, just barely 20 years old when he kind of was murdered.
It may come as a surprise to some people that there's a kind of due process in Germany at this time for Jewish people. And then now, albeit within the framework of a systematically corrupt legal code, but nonetheless, that afforded Jews the opportunity at various points to argue a legal case. So do you want to just talk about the legal situation that Jews found themselves in, even up to 1941 or so in Germany?
Yeah, so in Germany, it is really an interesting situation, because the public always thinks that starting in 1933, when the Nazis took over, this kind of legal vacuum started to emerge, and everybody could just put into concentration camps without any regards to the law. While this happened to, like, for example, political opponents right in the very beginning with these wild concentration camps. And also later, the Gestapo had the possibility to incarcerate people in concentration camps as a kind of preventive measure. In the cases of these rebellious Jews, it is really interesting that the Nazis had a law which they introduced in 1934, it was called the Law Against Treacherous Acts against the Nazi state and the Nazi party. And this was a law to quell any political opposition. And we never thought that this actually applied to Jews. But what I found out is that Jews were on a regular basis kind of punished under this law against treacherous acts, especially in the regarding the area of public protest. So when Jews criticized the regime, anti-Jewish measures, protested in public, the Nazis applied this law. So they were not immediately kind of put into a concentration camp. They were perceived as kind of harming kind of this law or kind of breaking this law. And so they ended up in special courts. And these special courts were established in 1933, again, for the reason to kind of quell political opposition. And we always thought of them as especially Nazified. Yeah? So they had a very kind of, they were Nazi persecutors. And we thought these are kind of premier institutions of the Nazi state. Still, in these special courts, Jews got acquitted.
Yeah.
And so it's really also for me, it was surprising because we thought always of the Nazi state, kind of this, that there is this steady Nazification of all institutions. But what I learned is from my research is that while this is true to a certain extent, we can't neglect that circumstances also play a role and individuals play a role. So certain circumstances like international situations like the threat of a war or individual situations, a certain judge can influence the outcome of these trials. And in a way, this whole legal system still perceived itself as adhering to law, even if they adhered to Nazi laws.
Right.
Yeah, or especially anti-Jewish legislation. But they called in witnesses, and when the witnesses were not perceived as reliable, then they would kind of say either the sentences is reduced or even Jews got acquitted still very late in the war, like in 1941.
Yeah, it's just amazing. It's almost like the presence of a law, even a corrupt and racist law, then creates the situation of a need for a trial, and then you're up to the particulars of the judge and so on. Does that sort of fit? I was thinking of the theory by what's his name, the guy that wrote Timothy Snyder, who, when he talks about like the difference for Jews in Germany as opposed to the East, where there's an absence of a state, a collapsed state in the East, where there's a kind of legal structure still in place in Germany that creates the conditions for survival. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, so I have to say I have a different opinion on this.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's an absence of a state in the occupied territories. There's a replacement of a state. There's a colonial state at work, which means that the situation is in fact different from Germany, because in Germany you have a grown legal system,
right,
and a tradition which you can't throw overboard within a few years. And in Eastern Europe, you have a kind of an occupation during a war, where kind of a colonial system is established. So there was no absence of a state, but a different state. And I think the different state speaks to the situation that the rules applied were so much more extreme than they were in Germany at the same time. So However, still, even in, for example, the annexed Polish territories, which were incorporated into the Reich, where, for example, the Ghetto Litzmannstadt was, German rules applied. Yeah, so we have also to distinguish what area are we talking about. Are we talking about occupied Soviet Union, Eastern Poland, Central Poland, the general government, or Western Poland, which was then part of the Reich? So everything where the German Reich kind of their laws applied, the situation was a little bit better. However, I would not say even that in Germany the situation was good, because I didn't mention this, but first of all, Jews could not pick their lawyers, because Jewish lawyers were, for example, kind of in a way barred from defending Jews. They didn't get kind of be licensed at kind of these courts. So they appointed non-Jewish lawyers, which sometimes, also depending on the individual, right? Sometimes did an okay job. Sometimes they were not interested at all. Sometimes, in one case, they didn't even appear at the trial. Yeah? So because they didn't care. Yeah. So but the legal situation in Germany so far was very different.
Yeah. So I mean, your work focuses in Germany, filling that sort of gap in the research. What can you say then about individual resistance in the East? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, let's go, when we think about Germany, I also did some research on, let's say, Bohemia, Moravia. You mentioned this earlier with the book. And for example, in Bohemia, Moravia, which was in a different situation than Germany proper, you have similar kind of acts of resistance, and also similar kinds of punishments of these similar acts of resistance. So you have the very kind of a similar scale of public protest of Jews, for example, in Prague or in Bohemia, as you have in Germany. We also know now from newer research, which has a little bit of broader understanding, and I mentioned this in the beginning, that researchers now are looking also into kind of ghettos in a different way than in previous decades, looking also into more like day-to-day actions. And they find, I think, similar acts of and ways of resistance. There's one key difference here. For Eastern Europe, and especially Poland, Israeli scholars were very early pointing out after the war that one big feat was religious, spiritual, and cultural resistance to preserve kind of Jewish community, Jewish religion, Jewish culture, Jewish tradition. Here, the situation with Germany is very different, because in Germany, the Nazis had a very different approach, because they wanted to segregate Jews from the rest of the society, so they confined them to their own spaces. They had to create their own cultural institution. So in a way, what they tried to destroy in Poland, they actually nurtured in Germany, because of the separation between Jews, non-Jewish, and Jewish Germans.
Yeah.
So Jews had kind of free and support, practically free support by the Germans, by the Nazi state, to create their own cultural kind of events, their orchestras, but by the way of expelling them from, let's say, public orchestras, private orchestras. So that's why these, for example, phenomena which we see in Eastern Europe, where culture is so important, and religion and spiritual resistance, this is very different the situation in Germany.
And you, I'm curious if you could just in panning out comment on actually I had a previous question I wanted to ask you too about Kristallnacht. There's another narrative you're challenging in this book is the idea that there's sort of, as things become more and more grim with the Holocaust and with the onset of the war, that resistance diminishes as you move toward 39 and beyond. So I was just curious if you could comment on Kristallnacht and then the onset of the war. Like, what's the impact of that on, or those events on Jewish resistance?
Yeah, so what I've found out in my kind of research is that it is really these Jewish resistance is in a way determined by individual responses to their surroundings. And this means when you have, for example, anti-Jewish legislation like the Nuremberg race laws, or violent events like Kristallnacht, or the beginning of the war, which kind of practically meant the end of any possibility to escape, these are kind of points in time where especially protests, like public protest, written protest, spikes. Yeah. So what I see is there is not a steady stream of resistance. It's really depending on the impact of certain kind of events and how individuals experience them. And I would say there is maybe something which is interesting to witness, that over time, also the oppression kind of and the experience of oppression accumulates kind of anger and repulsion. And I found certain hints that kind of quite a few Jews then acted out the way they did because they could not hold it together anymore, right? And even if they knew the potential consequences. And one of the moments in time is Kristallnacht, where you have more people speaking up after the day after in public with witnesses, protesting against the violence, trying also to forge solidarity, or even doing the event to kind of, in a way, document the crimes by taking pictures or by publicly kind of defending themselves against attacks. So I think this is remarkable to see and explains a little bit certain kind of acts of resistance.
Yeah. How has your work influence your understanding of the Holocaust more generally?
Yeah, so what I think, in a way, as I mentioned earlier, for me, this was a long trajectory from looking into kind of certain policies and institutions, ending up now kind of investigating the responses of the persecuted Jews. And we didn't talk about this, but I think I should mention, when we talk about Jews in this regard, we talk about a very kind of heterogeneous group, right? So first of all of these acts of resistance were performed by young and old people, men and women, educated, non-educated. So that's a very heterogeneous group for these reasons alone. But then also the group we are talking about is actually constructed by the Nazis, because it's not just members of the Jewish community, people of Jewish faith. We are also talking about people who converted to Protestantism. Sometimes their parents converted. So we are talking about Catholics and Protestants here too, right? Yeah. This is not just members of the Jewish community. And I think this is important also in this regard to think about this as this very diverse group of people who reacted.
I was surprised. One of the points you make in conclusion it challenges other assumptions. You talk about how, in general, resistance is across the board. Like there's no one group that you can say, oh, they're prone to resist. But women more publicly criticize, men more often engage in physical self-defense, and the elderly more than younger actively challenged forced name changes. So some of those were interesting to see, those general tendencies as well, and some resisted multiple times. So, you'd think like one brush with Nazi, criminal court or legal system or Gestapo that you would be, never do it again. But these are people that would go back for, resist yet again. So it's just remarkable.
Yeah, and if I may add, I mean, this is, I think, kind of an observation which is not only true for Germany. So, for example, if you look into, for example, resistance of Jews in Poland, you have similar attitudes among some of the people. So, for example, a good dear friend of mine came to my classes here at USC, who recently passed away, wrote this remarkable autobiography. His name is Sinon Neumark, and he describes in his autobiography how he escaped several camps, right? How he joined several resistance groups, how he kind of saves other Jews' lives. So he does this also, what I call this, he has this resistance career. So he never stops resisting, although he's punished for it and so on.
Yeah. What are some of the contributions that you would say, your book makes, or that you reflect on in thinking more broadly about resistance today, in whether in North America or elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think for me, the most striking lesson is that after discovering this kind of really widespread attitude, which, by the way, I also then afterwards I realized, why would we assume that nobody responded, right? That's crazy even to think about. I mean, so actually what I think is actually a normal way of reacting to things is to respond. And so I think what the book shows is if Jews under these most oppressive circumstances can resist, and if kind of all of these different people can resist, then there's no kind of excuse for anybody in any circumstances to say there's no chance, kind of the regime is too almighty. So actually it kind of challenges us in to think about our own responsibility in circumstances when we disagree, that we need to kind of act on it.
Well, that's a great place to end. I want to, if I could commend again this book to listeners. Highly recommend Resistors, How Ordinary Jews Fought Persecution in Hitler's Germany, published by Yale University Press. And I should say it's a Yale Press book, but it's at a very affordable price. So this is not a $100 University Press book. It's around $35. So highly recommend it. Wonderful stories in there. So Dr. Gruner, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us at OnScript.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. It was a great opportunity, and really also I enjoyed the conversation. So thanks a lot.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.